The night of my wedding, my bride looked into my eyes and whispered something that shattered my world. "I love someone else. I want a divorce." The music stopped, the guests froze, and my heart broke in silence. But before I could walk away from the altar, 3 mysterious riders appeared from the dark frontier road, carrying a silver locket, an old letter, and a truth about my past that no one was supposed to know. What they revealed that night changed every life standing there forever. Thank you for listening to this heartfelt story. If it moved you, please like, share it, comments below, and let someone know you are never alone. Lantern light trembled along the wooden beams of the old frontier hall. The smell of pine smoke and wild sage filled the night air. My wedding ring still felt warm against my skin. Then she spoke. Soft voice, shaking hands, eyes filled with a sorrow deeper than the valley outside. "I love someone else." The words fell like winter across my chest. Music faded behind me. Boots scraped across the wooden floor. Every sound around me grew sharp. The wind pressed against the windows. Cold crept through the open door. Pain moved slowly through my ribs, heavy and patient. Love leaves deep roots, even when the ground splits apart. She placed the divorce paper into my hand. Her fingers trembled. Mine stayed still. Outside, the frontier night stretched wide and lonely. Stars scattered above the dark hills. I stepped onto the dusty road, breath rough in the cold air. Shock lived in every heartbeat. Then hoofbeats broke the silence. Slow, measured. A rider approached through drifting moonlight. Tall figure, worn coat, kind eyes that carried storms and mercy at the same time. He studied my face as if he understood every hidden wound. "Hard night," he said quietly. The stranger dismounted and placed a steady hand on my shoulder. Warm, human, real. In that moment, the weight inside my chest shifted. Lantern light from the hall spilled across the road behind me. My bride stood in the doorway, her face pale with sudden fear. The stranger turned toward her. Recognition flashed across his eyes. The wind rose across the valley, dust lifted from the road, and the man beside me whispered my name with a voice that carried the past I buried beyond the western ridge. The past that returned tonight, riding through the dark frontier with a truth heavy enough to change every heart standing beneath those trembling stars, while my bride slowly stepped forward, and the paper inside my hand began to shake as the rider reached into his coat and revealed something that made the air around us tighten like a drawn bow, and my breath grew slow as the lantern flame flickered, and his next words began to rise into the cold night air, where the whole story waited to turn into something none of us expected, as I looked from his steady eyes to her trembling face, and the road behind him where another shadow moved through the moonlit dust, and I felt the strange certainty that love sometimes hides inside the most painful door that opens just before dawn, while the rider finally spoke again, and I listened with my whole heart as he began to tell me about the journey that led him here tonight, and the promise that changed the meaning of this wedding night, while the wind carried the distant sound of another horse climbing the ridge, and the lantern light trembled stronger against the dark as the figure in the distance came closer and closer, and my bride stepped beside me with tears shining across her cheeks, and the stranger slowly placed the object into my open palm and said the one truth that made the night around us hold its breath as the approaching rider reached the edge of the lantern glow and lifted their face toward us, and I felt the world shift beneath my boots as the meaning of love opened wider than the road stretching into the endless frontier, while the stranger leaned closer and began to explain why this night of broken vows carried the beginning of a story far greater than the one I believed I lived only moments ago. As the second rider finally stepped down onto the dusty ground and looked directly into my eyes and spoke my name with a voice filled with kindness, history, and a promise that made my wounded heart rise again as the lantern flame danced wildly and the wind swept across the valley, and I slowly turned toward my bride while the stranger waited for my answer, and the road ahead stretched into the unknown, where the truth of this night waited to unfold. As I opened my mouth to speak, and the second rider took one step closer and raised a trembling hand toward me, while the cold air filled my lungs, and the whole frontier seemed to listen as the story continued to rise between us beneath the restless stars. The rider's hand trembled in the lantern glow. Dust swirled slowly around our boots. My bride stood beside me, silent, breath shallow. The stranger watched both of us with calm patience, as if the night carried answers older than pain. Then the second rider stepped fully into the light. A young woman. Travel dust covered her coat. Moonlight touched her face. Familiar eyes, gentle, full of long miles and quiet courage. She looked at me as though my broken heart mattered. "I rode 3 days to reach this town," she said softly. Her voice carried warmth that pushed against the cold night. Behind us, the fiddle inside the hall tried to continue the wedding song, thin music drifting through the open door. The stranger beside me nodded slowly. "Truth travels slowly across the frontier," he said. My bride lowered her head. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. The paper in my hand fluttered in the wind. The young rider stepped closer, close enough that I could hear the rhythm of her breathing, close enough to see kindness shining through exhaustion. She held out a small leather pouch. My fingers opened. Inside lay a silver locket, old, scratched by years. A memory I buried beyond the western hills. My chest tightened. The young rider spoke again. "Your story travels farther than you imagined." The stranger rested his hand gently on my shoulder. Steady, understanding. A silent promise that some hearts still chose compassion. Lantern light flickered across the wooden walls. The night felt larger, full of secrets waiting for courage. My bride looked up at me again, fear mixed with regret in her eyes. The young rider opened the locket, a faded photograph inside. The wind grew stronger across the valley. Hoofprints deepened in the dust. Somewhere beyond the ridge, another horse climbed the road. Slow, patient. The young rider lifted her gaze toward me again, hope shining quietly through her tired smile. And as the stranger leaned closer and began to explain how the locket reached his hands on a distant trail where mercy crossed paths with destiny, and how the rider approaching the ridge carried a message that could change the meaning of every choice made tonight, I felt the strange pull of possibility rise inside my chest, while the lantern flame bent in the wind, and the young rider stepped nearer until the warmth of her presence pushed back the cold frontier air, and her voice lowered into a whisper meant only for me, as she began to tell the first piece of a story that connected my past with the road ahead. While the distant hoofbeats grew louder, and the shadow on the ridge moved slowly toward the circle of trembling light where our unfinished night waited to reveal the next truth just beyond the edge of breath and understanding. As I closed my fingers around the silver locket and lifted my eyes toward the approaching rider, while the stranger beside me nodded once more, and the young woman watched my face with quiet faith, as the wind carried the sound of that third horse stepping closer into the lantern glow, where the story continued to unfold across the restless frontier night. The hoofbeats grew clearer, slow, heavy, patient. Each step pressed deeper into the dusty road. Lantern light trembled across the ground. My fingers tightened around the silver locket. The metal felt colder now, alive with memories. The young rider watched the ridge, her breathing calm, steady like someone who trusted the road ahead. The stranger beside me shifted slightly. His coat brushed against my arm. Warm presence, quiet strength. Inside the hall, the fiddle finally fell silent. Guests gathered near the doorway. Whispers drifted into the night air. Curious eyes, uneasy hearts. My bride stood between two worlds. Behind her, the celebration waited. Before her, the truth gathered like a storm. The third rider appeared at the top of the ridge. Tall horse, dark mane moving in the wind. Moonlight stretched across the rider's shoulders. For a moment, the whole valley held its breath. The wind slowed, dust settled. The young rider beside me spoke softly. Everything changes after this moment. Her voice carried strange certainty. The stranger nodded once. The approaching rider began the slow descent, hooves striking stone, echoing across the quiet hills. My pulse moved harder through my chest. The locket grew heavier in my palm. The young rider leaned closer. Her whisper brushed my ear. That rider carries the missing piece. My bride stepped forward suddenly, fear flashing across her face. Regret, too. The lantern flame bent sharply as the wind returned. The third rider reached the edge of the light. Boot touched the ground. Tall figure, dust-covered coat. Calm eyes scanning each of us. Then those eyes stopped on the locket in my hand. Recognition sparked instantly. The stranger beside me folded his arms slowly, waiting, patient, as if the truth belonged to the one who just arrived. The rider stepped closer, boots grinding softly against the gravel. My bride held her breath. The young rider's gaze never left my face, and then the newcomer finally spoke. Low voice, carrying the weight of miles. You found it. Silence spread across the road. My throat tightened. Questions crowded my mind. The rider stepped closer again, close enough that lantern light revealed a weathered face marked by long journeys and quiet sorrow, while the wind moved across the valley, and the stranger beside me slowly removed his hat. And the young rider watched carefully as the newcomer reached into a worn saddlebag and drew out a folded piece of parchment sealed with dark wax and held it toward me with steady hands, while my bride stared in confusion, and the guests at the doorway leaned forward to hear every word as the rider began to explain how the locket traveled across distant towns through people who believed in mercy, and how the letter inside that pouch carried a truth connected to my past and to the woman standing beside me tonight, and even to the rider who waited patiently at my shoulder while the parchment seal cracked softly beneath my fingers and the lantern flame flickered brighter, and the wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain as the rider's next words rose slowly into the night, revealing the first line of a story far older than this wedding and far deeper than the pain inside my chest. While the stranger watched my reaction carefully, and the young rider placed a gentle hand against my arm as I unfolded the parchment and began to read the faded ink that changed the meaning of every road that led us here tonight, while the third rider stepped closer into the circle of light and pointed quietly toward the final line written across the bottom of the page, where a name waited for me to speak aloud. As the wind lifted again across the valley, and the lantern light shook against the wooden walls, and every soul standing in the doorway leaned closer as I slowly lifted my eyes from the parchment and looked directly at the rider who brought it here, and prepared to ask the question that began to rise inside my chest, while the young rider beside me held her breath, and the stranger watched the horizon, where another faint sound moved through the darkness beyond the ridge, as the night opened wider and the story continued to unfold across the silent frontier road. The parchment trembled between my fingers. Lantern light slid across the faded ink.
Every letter looked older than the sorrow in my chest. The rider waited, silent, patient as stone. The young rider beside me kept her hand on my arm, warm, steady. The stranger watched the horizon with quiet understanding, as if he knew the road still carried more truth toward us. My bride moved one slow step closer. Her dress brushed the dust, eyes filled with confusion, fear, hope. I lifted my gaze again to the rider. Wind pushed across the valley, cold and restless. "You carried this letter across the frontier," I said slowly. The rider nodded, face calm, voice low. "This story belongs to you." My heart pressed harder against my ribs. The parchment rustled softly. Inside the hall, someone lit another lantern. Golden light spilled through the doorway. The guests stood frozen in uneasy silence. The young rider leaned closer, her whisper gentle. "Read the second line." My eyes returned to the page. Ink scratched across fragile paper, words shaped by a careful hand, a promise written many years ago. My breath slowed. Every sound around me sharpened, hooves shifting, wind brushing the wooden walls. The stranger stepped slightly forward. His presence carried the quiet weight of a man who believed in redemption. My bride reached toward the parchment, her fingers trembling. "Who wrote it?" she asked softly. The rider answered before I could speak. "A man who believed love grows stronger after suffering." Those words settled deep inside my chest. The young rider watched my face closely, kindness shining through tired eyes. I read another line. The truth began unfolding like a long road finally seen at dawn. Then the rider pointed toward the final paragraph. "Your past traveled farther than you imagined," the rider said. The stranger lowered his hat over his heart, a silent gesture of respect. The wind lifted again across the ridge. Dust curled along the road. In the distance, another faint sound drifted through the dark hills. Hoofbeats, slow, measured. The young rider noticed first. Her eyes turned toward the horizon. The stranger followed her gaze, calm expression unchanged. My bride stepped closer to me now, close enough that I could feel her shaken breath. The parchment grew heavier in my hands. The approaching sound moved closer through the valley. Another traveler, another piece of the night. Lantern light flickered wildly as the wind grew stronger, and the rider who brought the letter leaned nearer and began to explain how the name written at the bottom of that parchment connected every soul standing on this dusty road, while the young rider watched my reaction with quiet faith, and the stranger folded his arms with the patience of a man who trusted the slow work of truth. And the hoofbeats from the distant hill continued to rise through the darkness, drawing closer to the circle of trembling light, where my unfinished wedding night slowly transformed into something deeper than heartbreak, while my bride looked from the parchment to my face as understanding began to dawn across her eyes, and the rider who delivered the letter gently tapped the final line of ink, where the name waited for my voice, while the wind carried the distant silhouette of the next traveler stepping down the ridge toward us, and I felt the strange certainty that this night still held another truth, powerful enough to reshape every promise spoken beneath these restless frontier stars, as I slowly lifted my voice to read the name written at the bottom of the page, while the approaching rider reached the edge of the moonlight and raised a hand in greeting, and the young rider beside me tightened her gentle grip on my arm, while the stranger nodded quietly, and the lantern flame bent low in the wind, as the story continued to unfold across the silent road, stretching far beyond the valley. The name left my lips slowly, soft, careful, as if the night itself listened. The wind quieted for a moment. Lantern light steadied against the wooden walls. The rider who carried the letter lowered his head. Respect filled the silence between us. My bride stared at me with wide eyes. Shock mixed with a fragile understanding. The young rider beside me watched the road again, her fingers still resting lightly on my arm. Warm, reassuring. The stranger shifted his boots in the dust, calm gaze moving from face to face. The third traveler continued down the ridge, hoofbeats steady, closer with every step. The parchment fluttered again, old paper breathing in the restless air. I looked back at the words. Every line now carried deeper meaning, a story of sacrifice, of long journeys across the frontier, of hearts wounded yet still willing to love. My chest felt tight, yet something inside began to rise again. Quiet strength. The writer who brought the letter spoke softly. That name opened many doors. My bride took another hesitant step. The lantern glow touched her tearful face. "Why tonight?" she asked. The stranger answered gently, "Because truth arrives when courage finally stands ready." The young rider nodded slowly, her eyes bright with belief. The third traveler reached the edge of the lantern light, horse breathing heavily from the long climb, dust drifting from tired hooves. The traveler dismounted, tall figure wrapped in a weathered cloak. For a moment the face remained hidden in shadow. The wind brushed the cloak aside. Lantern light revealed a calm expression marked by time and miles. Those eyes lifted toward the parchment in my hands. Recognition appeared instantly. A deep breath passed through the traveler's chest. Then the traveler spoke my name, low voice, warm with memory. My heart lurched. The stranger beside me watched carefully. The young rider's hand tightened slightly on my arm. My bride turned slowly toward the new arrival, confusion growing deeper. The traveler stepped closer, boots pressing softly into the dust. Lantern light flickered across the silver locket still resting in my palm. The traveler pointed toward it gently. That belonged to a promise once lost on the western trail. The wind carried the scent of distant rain across the valley. Every soul standing in the doorway leaned forward again. The rider who brought the letter crossed his arms and waited, patient as the mountains beyond the ridge. The traveler reached into the cloak. A second parchment appeared, edges worn by years of travel. The young rider drew in a quiet breath. The stranger removed his hat again, a gesture of respect for something sacred. My bride looked at me with trembling hope. The traveler held the parchment toward the lantern flame and began to speak about the long journey that connected the name written on my page with the promise sealed inside this second letter, while the wind lifted across the valley and the horse behind the traveler stamped softly against the earth, and the young rider beside me watched every movement with quiet faith, while the stranger leaned closer to read the worn edges of the parchment, and the guests in the doorway waited in breathless silence as the traveler slowly unfolded the letter and pointed toward the first line, where another truth waited to rise into the night, while my fingers tightened around the silver locket, and the lantern light danced across the traveler's face as the voice continued explaining how this forgotten promise traveled through many hands, guided by people whose hearts believed that love survives every hardship. While my bride stepped nearer with tears shining in her eyes, and the young rider's gentle grip reminded me that kindness still lived within this strange gathering beneath the restless stars, as the traveler lifted the parchment higher and invited me to read the first sentence aloud, while the wind stirred the dust around our boots, and the stranger nodded slowly toward the horizon, where the road stretched deeper into the dark frontier, carrying yet another distant sound that seemed to move closer through the hills as the night opened wider around us and the story continued to unfold. Lantern light warmed the parchment in my hands. The wind softened. The restless valley grew quiet, as if the frontier itself wished to hear the final truth. I read the first sentence slowly. Each word carried patience, forgiveness, and a courage stronger than sorrow. The traveler watched my face, calm eyes filled with understanding. The young rider beside me kept her gentle hand on my arm. The stranger stood still, like a guardian of the moment. My bride breathed deeply, tears shining under the lantern glow. The letter spoke of a promise made many years earlier, a promise that love grows through hardship, through mistakes, through the long road of human hearts learning compassion. The traveler stepped closer and pointed to the final line. Every soul deserves the chance to choose kindness again. The words settled over us like the first quiet light of dawn. My bride lowered her head, her voice trembled. I allowed fear to guide my heart. Silence followed, then the young rider spoke softly. Love grows where honesty begins. The stranger nodded with calm wisdom. The traveler folded the parchment carefully and placed it beside the silver locket in my palm, a symbol of journeys, mistakes, and the strength to rise again. I looked at my bride. Pain still lived in my chest, yet understanding slowly opened a new space within it. The frontier teaches patience. Storms pass, rivers find new paths, hearts learn again. My bride stepped closer, eyes filled with sincerity, hands trembling with hope. Around us, the guests slowly stepped outside, faces gentle now, no judgment, only quiet human understanding. The young rider smiled softly. The stranger placed his hat back upon his head. The traveler mounted the tired horse once more. The road beyond the valley waited, wide, endless, full of second chances. I closed my fingers around the locket and looked toward the rising horizon where the first pale light began to touch the distant hills. Love survives when hearts choose honesty over fear, forgiveness over pride, compassion over anger. And in that quiet dawn, I understood the deepest lesson the frontier ever teaches. Every life walks through broken moments, yet the people who listen, who share pain, who offer kindness, even when the road feels heavy, become the true builders of hope. Because love, real love, grows strongest in hearts brave enough to heal together.